All right, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Engblom with AECOM, and these are my teammates, Dr. Christina Hill from UC Berkeley, Chris Guillard from CMG, and Jeanette Kim from California College of the Arts. And together we are here to represent the All Bay Collective. We formed this team because of our respect for each other's work in the area and globally. We also were really committed to this idea of intergenerational learning, and all during this phase one we've been running 3 courses at UC Berkeley and CCA, and it's been an incredible iterative exchange of knowledge between disciplines and between generations, and a lot of the work has been generated by an exchange between the professionals and the students, and really all in service of us developing these ideas that are going to make the San Francisco Bay more resilient. So, how can we really, when we started this process, I really liked Hank's comments right after lunch about, we're not here about the sort of easy ideas. And so we made a comment in our first video that we want to build on the knowledge that we already have and ask questions that haven't been asked yet and develop research. So in those studios with the students, exchanging maps from our professional teams that have been developed in service of real projects, there's been some really innovative new ideas. So in addition to asking questions that have already been asked, like, how do we restore and adapt the ecologies, we need to ask, what are we going to do when the sea level rises and the ground flooding is higher and creating new ecologies? So that puts extra pressure on that question. And then the question of how can all of us continue to afford to live here? What do we do when we have 30% more people living here and welcoming more people to join us? And yes, we need to make our infrastructure more resilient to sea level rise and seismic activity. But how do we go beyond that to think about infrastructure as a way to catalyze new jobs and new housing in our most vulnerable communities? And as I said, how can we do this together between teachers and students, professionals, and the communities? All of these questions, we want to sort of dig deeper on those. And as part of the phase one touring and meeting with the experts, we heard some amazing quotes along the way that really, as we have our work sessions, we keep coming back to a couple of big ideas that, there is no shoreline, rather a shore zone. And we're a low-income community, and so the sort of really sad irony of it is that it's not our water, but it's flooding our homes. Those are really incredibly compelling ideas that have really stuck with us and really keep coming back to those. So, what do we do with those? And we have been working in the studios and in the offices in these in the neighborhoods. Ultimately, though, we think it's not going to be any one profession, not any one community, nor any one generation that will solve these challenges. So what we really believe that is at stake here is, or the really big opportunity is to create a new way of thinking about our relationship with the Bay. That can inspire everybody to get involved. And so that led us to an idea. There's a lot of complexity to all of these issues, and at 4 o'clock today you've listened to a lot of presentations, and so I want to try something here we've been excited about, sort of how do you simplify this down into an idea that can get everybody excited. And so let me give that a try. So for thousands of years we've been defining cities by lines. We've been defining and defending the edges between the city and nature, between wet and dry, between inside and outside, between the invested in and the neglected. This is very stressful. It's stressing us out. This is what all of these presentations are about. So we like the idea of going from the stress of living on the edge to actually just pulling that edge apart and jumping in. And trying to live in that uncomfortable answer of there is no sea level rise number, but rather we have to plan to a range of numbers. And there is no shoreline, it's a shore zone. All of that gets us excited. So how do you live in the edge? What we're saying is that in a time of sea level rising, groundwater flood rising, We need to expand the edge of the bay to include both habitat and housing for ecology and people living side by side. And we've asked ourselves how we can rethink the Bay Edge as a place where people and nature can coexist. And then the second big idea is that in the 20th century in particular, we built these corridors to get us as fast as possible from point A to point B, and it ripped apart communities. And what we want to do is really rethink that and say to ourselves that right now we have got a huge challenge because all of those corridors have to be elevated and protected from flooding and seismic activities, and also modernized to accommodate new technology. So this is our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really rethink those as a generator of jobs and housing, as a way to pull those communities together. So we call that big idea resilient corridors. So the first idea was tidal cities. Second one is resilient corridors. And then thirdly, it's an issue of, we've heard a lot about this from different groups today, but our take on it is that it's a governance issue. And these natural and man-made crises don't respect the fact that we call one area a town and the other one a city, or these municipal boundaries. So we and our policies do. So we need to think about new alliances among existing agencies and new partnerships between community advocates and the residents and the stakeholders so that we can leapfrog these jurisdictional boundaries. And we call this idea resilient equity hubs. Now, all three of these are big, important ideas independently, but we really believe that the real magic happens when we overlay them, and that's when we can transform our relationship to the Bay Edge and create some new, amazing ways to stay and live in that edge rather than retreat or wall ourselves off from it. Christina.
So what I'm going to introduce is the first of those ideas. And as Stephen said, we were trying to figure out how to combine the research that we had into some new ideas. We've been in the region looking at problems like this one. This happens to be the pump house in East Palo Alto, which is pumping groundwater every day, whether it rains or not. And we know that groundwater is going to be a big issue. We don't have a network of pumps that manage that for us. This is the exception, not the rule. So we're not ready for a higher water table. And we need to think about what that means. So the research my group was doing at UC Berkeley was to map where is there a shallow water table in the Bay Area, and I'll talk a little bit more about why, but this blue area on this map shows where the water table is within 6 feet of the surface, and that means that everywhere where the sea level rises 6 feet, all those blue areas would be emergent groundwater. So that's a very serious problem, would fill our pipes underground, would expose buildings to mold, could heave foundations. This is a very big deal in a region that hasn't had to manage this in the past. And it also increases our liquefaction risks. So in a seismic region, it's even more important that we understand how to deal with high water table zones. So we looked for examples. We looked at Amsterdam. We saw floating architecture. We thought, okay, this is something that we could potentially use here in an innovative and different way, but using some of the same proven technologies. And the problem is, as I'm going to show in these couple sections, that as the sea level rises, and that dark blue is salt water and the light blue is fresh water, we're going to see that light blue freshwater rise and eventually emerge on the land, even if we build levees and walls. So East Palo Alto has a good levee, still has groundwater flooding problems, doesn't affect it. So we need to figure out something that will allow us to do that. And one of the oldest ideas in landscape architecture is to dig hole and make mound. And if we do that, we can balance our cut and fill locally and use the reshaping of the land as the primary strategy for how we continue to occupy these wet zones. We can build a wider living edge and at the same time use back bay lagoons, ponds, as a way to manage water flowing off the land, manage stormwater, manage creek flooding, improve water quality before it hits the bay, and create value, because it's hard to see here, but we would actually propose putting floating housing, stacked prefabricated units, shared decking, Dutch style, in these back bay lagoons to create value and maintain value, because conventional architecture will fail, and that'll cause displacement. So we have to find a way to continue to occupy these places to adapt in place. And we can roll back with this strategy. We can use a new hole and a new mound to fill the old pond and move back to higher ground if sea level rise goes beyond 6 feet. So we're trying to use a new problem to come up with a new solution. And that illustration here in the bird's eye shows how a tributary might come through this band of tidal cities. And we call it tidal cities because they're actually meant to hold the high tide with a series of gates and mute the tidal fluctuation. So you don't have to go up and down 6 feet every day, twice a day, but you can actually put floating structures on something that might fluctuate maybe 2 feet. And then we think that these strategies for managing water will actually be vibrant urban districts. Someplace where not only can I live in one of those units, but I'm also doing a favor for the people around me because I'm holding their stormwater. So I'm living in infrastructure that protects my neighborhood. And we think that's a good deal. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk about how we would connect ourselves within this wetter shore zone.
All right, Tidal Cities is an exciting vision for how we can truly live in the edge. Resilient Corridors is really about how we link the edge. It's about how we create connectivity and stay connected in an uncertain future, but also, and more importantly, how we create win-win solutions in a time of certain change. So we all know that our existing transportation systems are already stressed and at capacity. That's obvious. Even without these new stressors, we have to do something. We also know that in many locations, our corridors are already vulnerable to tidal and storm-related flooding, and that in many locations, our corridors divide communities and sever important ecological connections between upland and bay. And so these issues will surely be exacerbated by climate change and population growth looking forward. In this simplified map, we've illustrated the level of impact of 6 feet of sea level rise on the transportation corridors that ring the bay and how they disconnect the various tributaries that flow from the highlands. And based on our analysis, we've identified that there's around 80 miles of highway that will be impacted at this stage, not to mention rail corridors and tributary streets that provide access to the highways. So as we look forward and envision a more resilient Bay Area, we do have this incredible opportunity, if not an imperative, to rethink and adapt these corridors, to anticipate new transportation technologies and modes of transportation, to create and build new multi-purpose infrastructures that address sea level rise, seismic, and flood risk together, and importantly, reconnect our riparian corridors for greater social and ecological movement. So what if we expanded our tributary corridors, elevated freeways, and constructed, or highway mobility corridors, and constructed them in a new and more resilient way to allow for greater movement of flora, fauna, people, and water? Put the corridors and tunnels in select locations to create the back edge of a horizontal levee and protect inland communities. Or utilize the air rights of the corridors in select locations for transit-oriented development that can connect communities and in turn provide new points of access to communities that currently don't have it. Raise the corridors in select locations where we need to address sea level rise, but also take advantage of those situations to create bayside habitat. And lastly, and I think really importantly, create new corridors that fringe and connect across the bay while setting the stage for restored wetlands and wetland migration. So the challenge, of course, and it's a complex one, is how do we stitch all of these ideas together while maintaining existing connectivity? We know that these corridors are incredible assets, and the question is how we work within them to rethink them. This is, I think, a particularly compelling example of how we might do that on the 880 corridor around the Oakland Coliseum. And so just taking a closer look at that, what it might be like at the intersection of an expanded riparian corridor, a new transportation corridor, and shore zone improvements. So what all of these really point to is this nexus between regional resilience and local opportunity and communities. And it also points out this clear fact that in order for us to be successful, we need to find new ways to share and collaborate across disciplines, across jurisdictions, and within our communities.
Great. So our third idea is called Resilience Equity Hubs and focuses on governance and social equity. This map is hard to read precisely because it shows the tangle of jurisdictions, political jurisdictions that we have overlaid with watersheds. Maps like these remind us that natural hazards don't follow political boundaries, and yet because we make plans and budgets within these structures, we often lack capacity to address the scale and complexity of climate risk. The issue here isn't any lack of public institutions. We have 9 counties, 101 cities, and scores of PDAs and PCAs. Nor is our only challenge a lack of will or resources. Though the cost of adaptation is daunting, we also have an extraordinary opportunity to harness the economic wealth of the Bay Area, the mandate created by Measure AA, and really the resourcefulness of local communities. So instead, we believe that one of our biggest challenges is a shortage of viable mechanisms for coordination. So in response, we created a toolkit of governance and financial mechanisms that can connect to design strategies at multiple scales. For example, this could include the Geological Hazard Abatement District or a transfer of development rights to fund public infrastructure in a way that could relate to local crowdfunding campaigns. At the scale of the neighborhood, REBS could also create incremental change as a process stewarded by local partners. So phase 1, for example, could identify where a high groundwater table overlaps with vacant or government-owned sites. Phase 2 could build the tidal city approach that Christina just described, bringing in higher density, affordable housing within these sites. And then phase 3 would really start to work across property lines, forming cooperative ownership models such as co-housing or community land trusts. And spatially, this can create a kind of adjacency across diverse landscapes, using ponds in one location to alleviate groundwater pressure in others, or storing water from a kind of network of green streets. And then phase 4 could really scale this up and realize the resilient corridor ideas that Chris just described. At the scale of a few city blocks, we could see this through the way that district heating or gray water recycling could connect new and old houses. Cooperative ownership could provide intergenerational care that can allow a single parent to go to work, as well as things like barbecues and tool libraries that could build social resilience among neighbors. All right, so the 3 ideas we've just presented complement each other. Through tidal cities, we live with water. Through resilient corridors, we stay connected. And through REBS, we make change possible for all of us. We've identified sites where there's a strong overlap between groundwater risk, transit vulnerability, and under-resourced communities. And this led us to San Rafael Bay, San Leandro Bay at the Oakland Coliseum, and East Palo Alto Baylands. Each of these places brings together a complex mosaic of cultural and ecological vitality, and we're really excited about the possibility of creating a new kind of resilience hub with these communities. So let's start with East Palo Alto Baylands, where sea level rise affects the very fabric of one of the last affordable cities in Silicon Valley. Though EPA is protected by levees and a healthy tidal water wetland, it's also vulnerable to flooding, which you can see in the dotted line, and groundwater inundation, which you can see in the blue dots. To address these issues, we've identified places where these 3 ideas can make the biggest difference. So tidal cities can bring about adaptive change to groundwater flooding. In green, public transit could start to reactivate the Dumbarton Corridor or ferry service at Cooley Landing. And then in orange, REB tools could fund projects like this, maybe coordinating efforts with the San Francisco Joint Power Authority. San Rafael residents too face significant challenges and opportunities and are really uniquely perched on an edge. San Rafael's downtown is built on tidal marshes and is vulnerable to flooding, groundwater inundation, and liquefaction. So in response, we've identified places in which a much more adaptive approach can protect from both rising tides and rising rents, and basically kind of connect back into habitats, job centers, and neighborhoods. Lastly, at San Leandro Bay and the Oakland Coliseum, you can see a real confluence of these questions, from Arrowhead Marsh to the Coliseum, and then across the BART tracks to the International Boulevard. And as the sports teams move out, this site will change. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to activate this public land, industry, logistics, transportation infrastructure that are all concentrated here, and to do so all in a way that residents can benefit from this wealth of resources. We heard about residents' sense of disconnection from jobs and the waterfront here, and as the site changes, it's just really important to get this right. So then our approach was to look for interdependencies across the San Leandro Bay area in a way that can connect tributaries fully to the bay, to use the Oakland Coliseum site as a pilot site for this high-density tidal development, and start to link these neighborhoods. So by drawing resources into communities, we can build on community advocacy that's happening today with a long-term vision for the future. And Stephen will wrap up with that in mind.
Okay, so I know we're out of time, but we have 2 steps really. First step is to really partner with the community organizations so that I really like the idea in one of the previous teams about educating. We're really about our partner, Miranda Mopin from SKIO, has a lot of experience at creating these experience-based learning that empower the communities. And step 2 is to embed into this process tools that all of us have created for very important public projects that are already things like games of tide, triple bottom line analysis, and a social equity checklist that we've already worked with some of the experts on in the community. So that would form the basis of our partnership with to co-create these projects. So with that, thank you very much, and that's it.